The air in the house was thick with the scent of wilting lilies and antiseptic, a morbid perfume that clung to the heavy velvet curtains and seeped into the polished mahogany. It was the smell of managed death, of a life being carefully, clinically extinguished. My father, Arthur Vance, patriarch of the Vance steel fortune, was dying. And his family, my family, had gathered like vultures dressed in cashmere, their grief a transparently thin veneer over a pulsating, ravenous greed. I sat by his bedside, my hand holding his skin a fragile, papery map of veins. His breath was a shallow, rhythmic rasp, the only sound in the cavernous bedroom besides the solemn tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a relentless metronome counting down his final moments. For weeks, this had been my world. The beeping monitors, the hushed consultations with nurses, the feel of his weakening grip in mine. He and I had always shared a quiet understanding, an unspoken language in a household that communicated primarily through stock prices and social posturing. He was the only one who saw me, Alara, not as a disappointment or a social liability, but as his daughter. "They don't understand you. Ellie," he'd whispered a few days ago, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Your strength isn't loud. It's deep. Like the river. Don't ever let them forget the river. The river was our secret." A small, winding creek at the edge of our sprawling estate where he'd taught me to skip stones and identify constellations. It was a place of quiet contemplation, far from the suffocating opulence of the main house. It was where he'd given me my only real inheritance years ago, a love for a world that existed outside our gilded cage. My mother, Beatrice, glided into the room, her posture impeccable, her sorrow as artfully applied as her makeup. She surveyed the scene, me in my simple jeans and sweater, holding her husband's hand, with a familiar flicker of distaste. To Beatrice, my refusal to play the part of the society heiress was a personal affront, a stain on the family's impeccable public image. "Alara, darling," she said, her voice a smooth, cool stone. "The lawyers will be here soon. Perhaps you should go and make yourself presentable." It was a command, not a suggestion. I looked down at my father. His eyes were closed, but I knew he could feel the tension that radiated from my mother. I squeezed his hand gently, a silent promise, and stood up. My older brother Richard was standing in the doorway, already dressed in a somber, impeccably tailored suit, his phone discreetly in his hand as he scrolled through market updates. He gave me a condescending smirk. "Don't worry, little sister," he drawled, his tone dripping with false magnanimity. "We'll make sure you're taken care of. A small allowance, perhaps. Enough for your little hobbies." His little hobbies included my volunteer work at the local animal shelter and my passion for restoring old furniture, pursuits my family deemed utterly worthless. They were activities that didn't generate profit or press, and were therefore contemptible. My sister Catherine appeared behind him, a perfect porcelain doll of a woman, her eyes sharp and calculating. She was her mother's daughter, a master of the backhanded compliment and the subtle social assassination. "Richard, be nice," she cooed, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. "Alara is sensitive. We must be gentle when we explain the realities of the world to her." The venom in her sweetness was more potent than any overt insult. I walked past them without a word, the heat of humiliation creeping up my neck. I knew what was coming. I wasn't naive. I had seen the closed-door meetings with the estate planners, the way their conversations would cease the moment I entered a room. I was an anomaly in their world of hostile takeovers and strategic marriages. I didn't fit, and in the Vance family, anything that didn't fit was discarded. I changed into a simple black dress, the only one I owned that felt appropriate for mourning a man who was still alive. I didn't do it for them, but for him, a final gesture of respect. When I returned, he was gone. The nurses were quietly removing the equipment, the room suddenly vast and empty. Beatrice was on the phone, her voice crisp and businesslike, already making arrangements. Richard and Catherine were flanking her, their expressions not of grief, but of grim, focused anticipation. The race was over. Now it was time to claim the prize. The reading of the will took place the following afternoon in the library, a room that always felt more like a museum than a part of a home. The walls were lined with leather-bound books that no one ever read, their gilded spines standing as silent, dusty sentinels. Mr. Abernathy, the family lawyer for 3 generations, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with an expression of weary disapproval, sat behind my father's massive oak desk. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the strained silence. My mother, Richard, and Catherine were seated on one of the plush leather sofas, a united front of tailored morning wear. I sat alone in a wingback chair opposite them, the space between us a palpable, frigid chasm. Mr. Abernathy began, his voice a dry monotone as he read through the usual legal jargon. He detailed the vastness of the Vance estate, the steel mills, the stock portfolios, the real estate holdings in 3 different countries. It was a staggering catalog of wealth, a king's ransom. I felt a profound disconnect, as if he were describing a family from a novel, not the people who had raised me. Then he came to the distribution of assets. The mansion and a controlling interest in Vance Steel were left to my mother, to maintain the family's standing and legacy. Richard was named the new CEO, inheriting the bulk of the company's shares and the immense power that came with them. Catherine received the international properties, a trust fund valued in the tens of millions, and my mother's priceless collection of jewelry. They sat there, their faces composed, but I could see the glint of triumph in their eyes. They had won. Every calculated move, every sycophantic word to my father over the years had paid off. Mr. Abernathy paused, shuffling his papers. He took a sip of water, his eyes briefly meeting mine with a look I couldn't quite decipher. It might have been pity. And to my youngest daughter, Alara, he read, his voice dropping slightly. I leaned forward, my heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. There had to be something. A small trust, the riverside cottage, anything to show he had remembered me. To my daughter, Alara, Mr. Abernathy repeated, whose gentle nature and artistic spirit, while admirable, have not prepared her for the rigors and responsibilities that come with managing great wealth. I leave the following. He paused again. The air crackled. Richard smirked. I leave her my collection of fountain pens in the hope that she will one day write her own story. I also leave her the contents of the safe deposit box held at the City Bank under key number 713. It is my deepest wish that she finds her own way in the world, unburdened by the weight of an inheritance she is not equipped to handle. Silence. A deep, ringing silence that was louder than any scream. My father's words, twisted and reshaped by my mother's influence, were a public declaration of my inadequacy. A final devastating vote of no confidence. Unburdened? He had untethered me and cast me out to sea. The fountain pens were a cruel joke. The contents of a safe deposit box were a mystery, but likely held nothing more than sentimental trinkets. He had left me, for all intents and purposes, with nothing. I felt the blood drain from my face. My breath caught in my throat, a ragged, choking sound. I looked at my family. Beatrice's expression was serene, a mask of maternal concern that didn't reach her cold, satisfied eyes. Catherine was examining her fingernails, feigning boredom. And Richard? Richard was smiling. A wide, predatory smile of absolute victory. Well, my mother said, her voice breaking the spell. She stood up, smoothing the front of her dress. That's all settled, then. A very sensible will. Arthur always was a practical man. Indeed, Richard added, rising to his full height. He looked directly at me, his eyes devoid of any warmth. Father knew you couldn't handle it, Alara. This is for the best. It protects you from yourself, protects me. The words escaped me, a hoarse whisper. You did this. You poisoned him against me, Beatrice let out a weary sigh. Don't be dramatic, darling. Your father saw the truth. You have no ambition, no drive. You float through life. This family was built on iron and will, not on finger painting and stray dogs. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. They weren't just taking my inheritance. They were erasing my worth, my very identity, defining me as a fragile, useless thing. I felt something inside me snap. The grief and shock that had paralyzed me began to cool, to harden into something else. It was a cold, sharp-edged fury. I stood up, my legs trembling but holding firm. I looked at the 3 of them, these strangers who shared my blood, and for the first time, I saw them with perfect, chilling clarity. They were not family. They were a cartel, a corporation, and I had just been deemed a non-performing asset. I see, I said, my voice steady now, infused with a calm I didn't know I possessed. I see everything. I turned and walked out of the library, leaving Mr. Abernathy staring at his papers and my family basking in their riches. I didn't run. I walked with a measured, deliberate pace up the grand staircase to my room, the one that had been mine for 26 years. Inside, my life was already being dismantled. A maid I didn't recognize was packing my books and clothes into cardboard boxes. My mother, ever efficient. Mrs. Vance said to have your things ready for collection by 6, the maid said, not meeting my eyes. That won't be necessary, I replied. I walked to my closet and pulled out a single duffel bag. I packed a few changes of clothes, my toiletries, and the worn copy of Walden my father had given me when I was 16. I went to my desk and took the small velvet-lined box that held his gift to me, an antique compass. So you never lose your way, he'd said. Lastly, I took the small ornate key that had been taped to the back of a photograph of us at the river. Key number 713. I walked out of the room, leaving the boxes of my former life behind. As I descended the staircase, my mother was in the foyer, directing 2 men who were removing a large landscape painting from the wall. The auction house is sending a van tomorrow for the rest of the collection, she said to an assistant, before turning her gaze on me and my bag. Leaving so soon? There's nothing for me here, I said, my voice flat. Don't be bitter, Alara. It's an unbecoming emotion, she advised, a final, perfectly delivered barb. You're welcome to call us, of course. Once you've had time to adjust to your new circumstances. I didn't grace her with a response. I walked out the heavy oak doors and into the crisp autumn air. I didn't look back at the magnificent stone facade of the house I had grown up in. I didn't see it as a home anymore. I saw it as a fortress, and I had just been exiled. As I walked down the long gravel driveway, the weight of the duffel bag on my shoulder was nothing compared to the weight of their betrayal. But as the gates of the Vance estate closed behind me with a final, definitive clang, a strange lightness filled my chest. They thought they had unburdened me. They thought they had cast me out with nothing. They were wrong. They had given me the one thing I never knew I needed, a reason. They had left me with a story to write, and I would make sure it was one they would never forget. The river, my father had said. A river doesn't smash through obstacles. It flows around them, wearing them down over time, gaining strength with every mile. My journey had just begun, and I would become a force of nature. The city felt alien. For 26 years, I had only ever experienced it from the plush leather interior of a chauffeured car, the streets and faces a blurred, distant tableau behind tinted glass. Now I was in it, a ghost at street level, anonymous and untethered. The rhythmic clang of the estate gates closing behind me echoed in my mind, a sound of finality, of a door being not just shut, but locked and barred. My first purchase as a disinherited woman was a lukewarm coffee from a street vendor and a bus ticket to a part of the city I only knew from maps. I spent that first night in a sterile, $20 a night motel room that smelled of bleach and despair. The threadbare blanket offered little warmth against the chill that had settled deep in my bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I lay on the lumpy mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling, and for the first time, allowed the full weight of my father's betrayal to crash down on me. It wasn't just the money. It was the words. Unburdened. Not equipped. Phrases meticulously crafted by my mother and brother, delivered through my dying father's last will and testament. They had used his voice to validate their own contemptuous assessment of me. They had stripped me not just of my birthright, but of my father's belief in me. The fountain pens, his supposed token of affection, felt like a mockery, a collection of useless, ink-stained relics. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my brother's triumphant smile. The next morning, I awoke with a stiff neck and a hollow feeling in my stomach. But the sharp edges of my grief had solidified overnight into a cold, hard resolve. I had one destination, one slim and probable thread to pull on: the safe deposit box. The city central bank was an imposing marble edifice, a temple dedicated to wealth and power. It was the same bank the Vance Corporation had used for generations. As I walked in, dressed in my simple jeans and carrying my life in a duffel bag, the security guard's eyes lingered on me. I could feel the silent judgment of the tellers in their starched shirts, the dismissive glances from the wealthy patrons. For the first time, I was on the outside looking in. At the vault services desk, a severe-looking woman with a tightly pinned bun looked at me over her spectacles. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone implying that she doubted it very much. "I'm here to access a safe deposit box," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Number 713, the name is Alara Vance." Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly at the name. She typed something into her computer, her brow furrowed. "One moment." She disappeared into a back room and returned a few minutes later, her expression now one of professional neutrality. She led me through a massive circular steel door into the vault. The air was cool and still, smelling of old paper and metal. It felt like a tomb. She used her key, then gestured for me to use mine. I slid the small, ornate key number 713, into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. The woman pulled out a long, surprisingly heavy metal box and placed it on a small table in a private viewing room, closing the door behind her and leaving me alone. I stared at the box for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it. The final word from my father. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, there were no jewels, no stock certificates, no bearer bonds. The first thing I saw was a stack of cash, bound with a simple rubber band. I counted it quickly. $51,000 bills. $50,000. It was a significant amount of money to me now, a lifeline. But in the context of the Vance fortune, it was less than a rounding error. It was pocket money. Beneath the cash was a thick manila envelope. I opened it and slid the contents out. It was a deed to a property I'd never heard of, 1412 River Street in the old industrial district. A forgotten, run-down part of the city that the Vance family had systematically avoided for decades. And at the very bottom of the box, lying on a bed of faded black velvet, was a single fountain pen, a beautiful vintage Mont Blanc, far older and more elegant than any from his desk collection. Next to it was a sealed envelope of heavy cream-colored stationery, with a single word written on the front in my father's familiar, elegant script, Alara. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal. The letter was several pages long, written with the very pen that lay beside it. My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the vultures have done what vultures do. I am sorry. I am sorry for the public humiliation I know they have put you through. Please know those were not my words, but my transcription of their will. I was too weak to fight them at the end, but I was not too weak to plan. Forgive me for the deception. It was the only way to give you a true inheritance, one they could not touch, poison, or control. They have never understood you because they measure strength in noise, in aggression, in dollars acquired. Your strength is quieter, but infinitely more resilient. It is the strength of the river we loved, the water that seems soft but can carve canyons out of solid rock over time. They have left you with what they think is nothing. I have left you with everything you need. A beginning. The $50,000 is your cushion. Use it wisely. It must last. The pen is for you to write your own story, just as the will cruelly suggested. Let it be a reminder that your narrative is now entirely in your hands. And the deed. The deed. 1412 River Street. It was the first workshop my own grandfather ever owned, before Vance steel was even a dream. It is where our family's fortune was truly born, not in a boardroom, but with sweat, sawdust, and calloused hands. It has sat empty for 70 years. It is probably a wreck. But it is on the river, Ellie. It has history. It has integrity. It is yours. They think you are unequipped for their world. They are right. You are not ruthless or greedy or cruel. And for that, I have never been more proud. Your gift is not in managing wealth, but in creating it. You see value where others see junk. You breathe life into forgotten things. You did it with every piece of broken furniture you ever dragged home, transforming it into something beautiful and useful. Don't try to beat them at their game. Create your own. That workshop is your blank canvas. The money is your first set of paints. Your hands and your heart are your true inheritance. Show them, don't tell them. Just build your world, piece by piece, and they will one day have to look upon it in wonder. Never forget the river. Never forget who you are. I have always believed in you. All my love. Father tears streamed down my face, hot and cleansing. They were not tears of grief or self-pity, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief. He hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't seen me as a failure. He had seen me all along and had orchestrated this one final secret act of faith. He had armed me. The public will was a charade, a diversion to protect this, my real legacy. The cold knot of betrayal in my chest dissolved, replaced by a fierce, burning love and a profound sense of purpose. I packed the contents back into the box, returned it to the vault attendant, and walked out of the bank, leaving my duffel bag with the concierge. I hailed a taxi, a luxury I knew I couldn't afford for much longer, and gave the driver the address. 1412 River Street, he grunted. Not much down there anymore, miss. Just old warehouses. It's what I'm looking for, I said, my eyes fixed on the city passing by. The further we drove, the more the gleaming skyscrapers and pristine avenues gave way to brick, rust, and cracked pavement. This was the city's forgotten underbelly, the place where things were made and then left to decay. The taxi pulled up in front of a 2-story brick building, its windows boarded up, its large wooden doors faded to a splintery gray. A faded sign above the door read, "Vance and Son Woodcrafts." It was perfect. I paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk, the deed clutched in my hand. The air smelled of damp earth and the nearby river. The building was larger than I expected, and while it was dilapidated, the brickwork was solid, the foundation firm. It had good bones. It took me half an hour and a good deal of my strength to force the old lock on the main door. It creaked open into a cavernous space. Dust motes danced like fairies in the shafts of light that pierced through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The ground floor was a massive, open workshop, littered with the ghosts of industry, rusted tools, rotting leather aprons, and the hulking silhouettes of ancient belt-driven machinery. A thick layer of dust covered everything, a blanket of time. Up a rickety set of stairs was a small apartment, a Spartan living space with a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. It was filthy, but it had plumbing and electricity. It had a roof. It was a home. My home. I walked back down to the main floor and stood in the center of the vast, silent space. My family in their sterile mansion were probably drinking champagne, toasting their cleverness and congratulating themselves on their victory. They were celebrating the end of a chapter. I, on the other hand, stood in the dusty, forgotten heart of my family's true origin, holding the keys to my future. I saw past the dirt and the decay. I saw a workshop buzzing with life. I saw sanding blocks and varnish, lathes and saws. I saw piles of discarded wood and broken chairs, and I saw the beautiful, sturdy, one-of-a-kind pieces they could become. My father was right. I wasn't made for their world. I was made for this one. A world where value was not inherited, but created with your own 2 hands. I took a deep breath, the dusty air filling my lungs. It smelled like freedom. It smelled like work to be done. I rolled up my sleeves, a real, genuine smile spreading across my face for the first time in what felt like an eternity. My story was no longer a matter of hope. It was a matter of ink and sawdust and will. And it was time to get to work. The first few weeks were a baptism by grime. The workshop wasn't just dusty. It was a tomb of forgotten labor, layered with the greasy residue of old machinery and the fine, gritty silt that the river deposited over decades. I tied my hair back with a bandana, bought a pair of workman's gloves that were 2 sizes too big, and began the colossal task of reclamation. I shoveled out debris, swept away mountains of dust, and scrubbed every surface with a fury fueled by adrenaline and cheap coffee. My days were a blur of aching muscles and the metallic smell of rust. My nights were spent upstairs in the Spartan apartment, collapsed on a mattress on the floor, too tired to dream. The $50,000, which had seemed like a fortune in the bank, began to evaporate with alarming speed. A pragmatic plumber named Gus, with a belly that strained the fabric of his overalls, took a large chunk to get the water running and the ancient boiler to stop sounding like it was preparing for a final, violent explosion. An electrician with skeptical eyes rewired the entire building, warning me that the old knob and tube system was a fire waiting to happen. Permits, fees, dumpsters. Every day brought a new invoice, a fresh drain on my dwindling resources. I lived on instant noodles and toast, and the numbers in my bank account ledger, which I tracked meticulously in a $5 notebook, marched steadily downward. Amidst the chaos of renovations, I carved out a small corner of the workshop for myself. I used what was left of my money to buy a few essential tools, a good quality orbital sander, a set of chisels, and clamps. My first projects were sourced from the bottom of the barrel. I drove a beat-up third-hand pickup truck I'd bought for a steal and scoured back alleys and junkyards. I became a connoisseur of trash. I'd find a 3-legged Victorian side table, its remaining leg beautifully carved, or a solid oak dresser with a shattered mirror and peeling veneer. To anyone else, it was firewood. To me, it was potential. The work was my salvation. The rhythmic scrape of a hand plane shaving away decades of neglect, the meditative process of sanding wood grain until it felt like silk beneath my fingertips. The satisfaction of seeing a wobbly joint become strong and true. In these moments, the noise in my head would fall silent. I wasn't Alara Vance, the disinherited disappointment. I was a creator, a restorer. My hands, once soft and manicured, were now calloused and stained, and I had never been prouder of them. Each splinter was a badge of honor. I sold my first piece online. It was a small, bow-fronted chest of drawers I had found in a dumpster, its finish ruined by a massive water stain. I stripped it, sanded it, and refinished it in a deep sapphire blue, polishing the original brass hardware until it gleamed. I took a picture of it against the clean brick wall of the workshop and listed it on a local marketplace app for $200. It sold in less than an hour. The woman who bought it was a young teacher furnishing her first apartment. When she picked it up, her eyes lit up. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice full of genuine delight. "It has so much more character than anything new." That $200 felt more real, more earned, than any allowance I had ever received. I held the cash in my hand, 4 $50 bills, and felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was proof that my father was right. I could make something from nothing. My new life brought me into a new ecosystem. The industrial district, while neglected, was not deserted. It was a neighborhood of niche craftsmen, of welders and upholsterers and mechanics, people who worked with their hands. My nearest neighbor, 2 warehouses down, was a man named Sam Petrowski. He was a metalworker, a third-generation artisan who could bend steel as if it were clay. He was a hulking man in his late 60s with a magnificent white beard, eyes the color of a summer sky, and hands the size of dinner plates. He first appeared in my doorway one afternoon, drawn by the sound of my sander. He stood there for a long moment, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable as he watched me work. "You the one making all the racket?" he finally rumbled, his voice a low growl. I switched off the sander, my heart jumping into my throat. "I'm sorry, am I bothering you?" He grunted, his eyes scanning the half-finished pieces in my workshop. "Vance," he said, looking up at the faded sign above my door. "I knew your great-grandfather." Tough old buzzard. "Drove a harder bargain than the devil himself." He looked at me, at my clean-faced private school features. "You don't look like a Vance." "I'm a Lara," I said, extending a sawdust-covered hand. He ignored it. "Sam," he said. "So, the rich girl comes back to the gutter to play with her dollhouses." The comment stung, but I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not playing," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm working." "This is my business." He grunted again, a sound of profound skepticism, and turned to leave. But he paused in the doorway. "That belt on your sander is frayed. It's gonna snap and take your eye out if you're not careful." And then he was gone. I checked the sander. The belt was indeed dangerously frayed. Sam became a recurring grumpy presence. He would appear without warning, offering gruff, unsolicited advice. "You're using the wrong grit for that cherry wood. You'll scratch it to hell. Your finish is bubbling, too much humidity in here. Don't buy your tools from the big box store. They're garbage. Go to Old Man Hemlock's on 5th Street. He never smiled, never offered a word of praise, but his advice was always right. Slowly I realized this was his way. He wasn't judging me. He was testing me. He was waiting to see if I would quit. And when I didn't, a grudging respect began to form between us. One day, my drill press seized up, a plume of acrid smoke pouring from the motor. I couldn't afford a new one. The next morning, I found a heavy, ancient, but perfectly maintained drill press sitting outside my workshop doors. There was no note. When I went to thank Sam, he just shrugged. It was collecting dust, taking up space. But I saw the faintest flicker of something in his piercing blue eyes. I was no longer an outsider. I was part of the neighborhood. Despite my small successes, my financial situation was precarious. The renovations had cost more than I'd budgeted for, and sales, while steady, were not enough to build any kind of safety net. I was living on a knife's edge, one major setback away from disaster. And then disaster struck. I had taken on my first big commission, restoring an entire dining set for a wealthy client who lived in one of the city's upscale suburbs. It was a complex job, an antique Heppelwhite set that required delicate inlay work. The payout would have been enough to cover my expenses for 3 months. I spent weeks on it, pouring all my skill and energy into the project. The day before it was due, I was applying the final coat of lacquer when a freak autumn storm rolled in. The wind howled, and before I could react, a loose piece of flashing on the roof tore free, and a torrent of filthy rainwater poured directly onto the magnificent dining table. The damage was catastrophic. The fresh lacquer was ruined, the wood was warped, and the delicate veneer was lifting. It was unsalvageable. I called the client and explained, my voice hollow with defeat. She was, to my surprise, not angry, but her disappointment was a physical blow. She canceled the commission. I had not only lost the payment, but I had wasted weeks of work and expensive materials. That night, I sat in the middle of my workshop, surrounded by the beautiful, ruined furniture, and I wept. The cold tendrils of panic I had kept at bay for months began to tighten around my chest. My bank account was nearly empty. I had failed. The triumphant smiles of my mother and brother flashed in my mind. They were right. I was a failure. I was not equipped. The next morning, Sam found me staring blankly at the warped table, my coffee untouched. He surveyed the damage, his expression grim. "Bad break," he said. It was the closest he'd ever come to expressing sympathy. "It's over, Sam," I whispered. "I'm done. I can't afford to fix this. I can't afford the rent on this place. I can't—" My voice broke. He was silent for a long time. Then he walked over to a pile of scrapwood in the corner, offcuts from my projects, pieces I had deemed unusable. He picked up a piece of dark, rich walnut, turning it over in his huge hands. Then he picked up a piece of rusted rebar from a pile of junk near the door. "What is this?" he asked, holding up the wood. "Scrap," I said miserably. "And this?" he asked, holding up the rebar. "Junk?" "No," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This," he said, tapping the wood, "is warmth, history. This," he tapped the rebar, "is strength. The bones of this city." He looked at me, his gaze intense. "Your problem isn't the table. Your problem is you're still thinking like them. You're fixing their old things for their new houses. You're playing their game, just on a smaller scale. Your father's letter, he told you to create, not just to fix." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Don't try to beat them at their game. Create your own. I had been so focused on restoring the past that I hadn't even thought about building a future. I looked around my workshop, but this time with new eyes. I didn't see junk and scrap. I saw raw materials. I saw the patina of rusted metal, the deep, gnarled grain of reclaimed lumber from a demolished warehouse, the thick, industrial glass from a salvaged factory window. I saw the history of this neighborhood, its grit and its integrity. An idea began to form, a fragile spark at first, then a growing flame. Why just restore old furniture? Why not create something entirely new? Something that celebrated the materials everyone else threw away. Something that fused the organic warmth of wood with the cold, hard strength of industrial steel. A style that was uniquely mine, born from this place, from this river, from this struggle. I walked over to my workbench, pushing aside the ruined remnants of the dining set. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and the Mont Blanc pen my father had left me. The ink flowed smoothly onto the page. I began to sketch. It wasn't a chair or a table from the past. It was a coffee table, its top a single thick slab of reclaimed oak, its raw living edge preserved. Its legs were not carved wood, but sleek angular steel, welded and polished. It was a fusion of nature and industry, of past and present. It was bold, it was different, and it was mine. I looked at the sketch, my heart pounding with a new kind of excitement, an emotion that eclipsed the dread and failure of the night before. This was more than just a piece of furniture. It was a declaration of independence. My family had built an empire on new steel, dug from the earth. I would build mine on the old, the discarded, the forgotten. I would build it on beauty they were blind to. I had lost a battle, but I had just discovered the blueprint for the war. The sketch was a promise. Turning it into reality was a war against physics. My experience was with wood, a forgiving organic material that could be coaxed and shaped. Metal was an entirely different beast. It was stubborn, unforgiving, and demanded respect. My first attempts to work with steel were a disaster. I bought a cheap secondhand welding kit and nearly set the workshop on fire trying to join two pieces of rebar. The resulting weld was a lumpy, porous monstrosity that snapped with a gentle tap of a hammer. It was clear I couldn't do this alone. Swallowing my pride, I walked down to Sam's workshop, sketch in hand. The roar of a plasma cutter and the shower of blue-white sparks were intimidating. Sam was in his element, a leather-aproned Vulcan manipulating molten metal with a steady hand. He glanced up as I entered, cutting the torch with a hiss. "Come to borrow a cup of sugar?" he grumbled, lifting his welding mask. "I need your help," I said, getting straight to the point. I laid the sketch on his massive steel workbench. "I want to build this. I know wood. I don't know steel. He studied the drawing, his brow furrowed. He traced the clean, angular lines of the steel legs with a calloused finger. For a long moment, he said nothing. I braced myself for a sarcastic dismissal, for another lecture on the folly of rich girls. "This is not bad," he said finally, the words sounding like they had been physically dragged from his throat. It was the highest praise I had ever received from him. "It's honest. The materials speak for themselves." He looked at me, his blue eyes appraising. "You want to learn to weld?" "I want to learn how to build this," I corrected. "Whatever it takes," and so my apprenticeship began. Sam was a brutal, exacting teacher. He tolerated no shortcuts, no sloppiness. "Heat is your paintbrush, Alara," he'd roar over the shriek of a grinder. "Learn to control it, or it'll make a fool of you every time." He taught me how to read the molten puddle of a weld, to listen to the hiss of the gas, to feel the right amount of pressure. He showed me how to cut steel with a precision I never thought possible, how to grind the weld smooth, and how to apply a patina that gave the raw metal a deep, lustrous finish. My days became a grueling routine. Mornings were spent in Sam's fiery workshop, my arms aching, my face smudged with soot, learning the unforgiving language of metal. Afternoons were spent back in my own space, applying those lessons and working with the wood that was my sanctuary. I began to source my materials with a new focus. I wasn't just looking for antique furniture anymore. I befriended demolition crews, paying them for slabs of old-growth pine and oak joists from buildings being torn down. I scavenged scrap yards for interesting pieces of steel, I-beams, gears, thick plates of rust-pocked metal. My workshop slowly transformed from a restoration studio into a design lab, a place where industrial detritus was reborn. My first piece was the coffee table from my sketch. I found the perfect top, a 3-inch thick slab of maple from a dismantled bowling alley, its surface scarred with decades of impact. I spent days sanding it, not to a perfect sterile smoothness, but just enough to reveal the deep swirling grain while preserving the character of its history. For the base, I used 2 thick I-beams, cut and welded into a clean minimalist support. When I finally bolted the 2 elements together, I stood back, my heart pounding. It was exactly as I had imagined it. The warm, storied history of the wood contrasted beautifully with the cool, uncompromising strength of the steel. It wasn't just a table. It was a statement. It was the story of this neighborhood, of this city. It was my story. Fueled by this success, I began to create a small collection. A dining table made from the floorboards of a 19th century textile mill, set on a delicate but strong frame of welded steel rods. A bookshelf that used reclaimed pipes for its structure and rough-sawn lumber for its shelves. A console table whose top was a single, polished piece of slate I'd found in a quarry, supported by a web of intricately welded rebar. Each piece was a challenge, a conversation between 2 disparate materials. I named the collection the River Street Line. Sam watched my progress with his usual gruff silence, but one afternoon he walked in as I was photographing the finished collection. He circled the dining table, running his huge hand over the smooth wood, then rapping his knuckles on the steel frame. "You got something here, kid," he said quietly. "People will either get it or they'll hate it. There won't be much in between." He was right. My first attempts to sell the pieces were soul-crushing. I took my portfolio of professional-looking photos to the upscale furniture boutiques in the city center, the kind of places my mother frequented. The owners would flip through the pages with a polite but dismissive air. "It's very industrial," one woman said, her nose wrinkled as if she smelled something unpleasant. "Our clients are looking for a more refined, a more classic aesthetic. A bit too rustic," said another, a man with a perfectly coiffed haircut. "The live edge wood is a trend, I suppose, but the steel is very aggressive." They saw scrap wood and raw metal. They didn't see the history, the craftsmanship, the story. Each rejection felt like a personal failure, a confirmation of every doubt I'd ever had. I was an imposter, a dilettante playing with junk. I began to despair. The collection, which I had poured my heart and my last dollars into, sat in my workshop, gathering dust. The fear that had subsided began to creep back in, cold and suffocating. One rainy Tuesday, feeling utterly dejected, I was making a delivery of a small restored nightstand, a quick, cash-in-hand job to pay the electricity bill, to an art gallery in the city's trendiest district. As I was leaving, the gallery owner, a striking woman in her 40s named Juliana Croft, stopped me. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and wore an all-black outfit that made her look like a piece of modern sculpture herself. That's a lovely restoration, she commented, gesturing to the nightstand. The finish is impeccable. Thank you, I said, surprised. Do you have a card? She asked. On a whim, instead of giving her my card for Alera's restorations, I pulled out my phone. I've been working on a new project, actually. I hesitated, then showed her the photos of the River Street line. She took the phone, her expression neutral at first. She swiped through the images slowly, then went back, zooming in on the details, the joinery of the wood, the texture of the welds. The silence stretched on. I held my breath. Who makes these? She asked, her voice sharp with interest. I do, I said, my voice barely a whisper. She looked up from the phone and really saw me for the first time. She took in my worn jeans, my paint-stained fingernails, the faint smell of sawdust that clung to me. A slow smile spread across her face. My gallery, we don't just show paintings, she said. We show artists who have a point of view, who have something to say with their medium. This isn't furniture. This is functional sculpture, she handed my phone back. I'm curating a show next month for emerging local artists. It's called Urban Reclamation. I have an empty space right in the front window. It would be perfect for that dining table and a few of the smaller pieces. If you're interested, I stared at her, dumbfounded. The words wouldn't come. I felt a dizzying rush of vertigo, as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. The boutiques had rejected me because they saw furniture. Juliana was offering me a spot in her gallery because she saw art. Interested? I finally managed, a laugh bubbling up, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Yes, I'm interested. The 2 weeks leading up to the show were a frantic, exhilarating blur. Juliana was a force of nature. She didn't just give me a space. She invested in me. She helped me write an artist's statement, pushing me to articulate the philosophy behind my work. Don't just tell them what it is, Alera, she instructed, pacing her minimalist, white-walled office. Tell them why it is. Talk about the soul of the city, the beauty in the discarded, the dialogue between history and modernity. With her guidance, I found the words to describe what I had been doing instinctively. I wrote about the Vance family not with bitterness, but as a point of origin, the empire built on new steel, and how my work was a response to that, a search for value in the old, the overlooked. I wrote about the river, about Sam, about the integrity of working with your hands. The night of the gallery opening was surreal. Sam, looking deeply uncomfortable in a clean button-down shirt, came with me. We stood in a corner as people began to stream in. It was an intimidating crowd of art critics, interior designers, and wealthy collectors, the very people I had once called my peers, but from whom I now felt utterly disconnected. My collection was displayed in the front of the gallery, beautifully lit, commanding the space. People were drawn to it immediately. They ran their hands over the wood, examined the welds, and read the artist's statement I had mounted on the wall. They talked in low, appreciative tones. They weren't just looking. They were engaging. Then, a man who was pointed out to me as the city's most influential design critic stood in front of my dining table for a full 10 minutes. He walked around it, crouched to examine the base, and then read my statement twice. I felt sick with nerves. Later that evening, Juliana found me, a triumphant glint in her eyes. She held a flute of champagne in one hand and a small red sticker in the other. "Congratulations, Alera," she said, placing the sticker on the price tag next to the dining table. "You just sold your first sculpture." I looked at the price tag. $5,000. It was more money than I had made in the last 6 months combined. I looked at the red dot, a symbol of validation so profound it almost didn't feel real. Then another red dot went up on the console table, and another on a set of end tables. By the end of the night, half of the River Street line had sold. As the crowd thinned, Sam clapped me on the shoulder, his hand nearly engulfing it. "Told you," he rumbled. "They get it." His eyes were shining with a pride he couldn't quite conceal. I walked to the gallery window and looked out at the glittering city lights. Just a few months ago, I had been an outcast, alone and terrified, with nothing but a key and a letter. Tonight, I was an artist. I had taken the ugliest, most painful chapter of my life and transformed it. I hadn't just salvaged wood and steel. I had salvaged myself. My father had told me to write my own story. I finally had my first sentence, and it was a damn good one. The success of the gallery show was a flash flood. One moment I was in a drought, praying for rain. The next I was fighting to keep my head above water. My phone, once silent for days on end, now buzzed incessantly. Emails from interior designers, architects, and private collectors flooded my inbox. The Design Critic's review, published in the city's most prestigious lifestyle magazine, had described the River Street line as a powerful, post-industrial poetry and the birth of a vital new design voice. The words were so laudatory, so disconnected from my reality of instant noodles and sawdust-filled pockets, that they felt like they were describing someone else. The money from the sales was a shock to my system. I deposited the checks with a trembling hand, watching the balance in my bank account swell to a number I hadn't seen since my days of receiving a family allowance. My first instinct, born of months of scarcity, was to hoard it, to build a fortress against the looming specter of failure. But Juliana, who had seamlessly transitioned from curator to mentor, quickly disabused me of that notion. "This isn't a prize, Ilara," she told me over coffee in her stark white office. "It's seed money. It's your next round of investment. That show gave you one thing far more valuable than cash: momentum. If you stop now, you'll be a one-hit wonder. A quaint little story for a magazine. We need to build a brand." She was relentless, her mind moving at a speed that left me dizzy. She laid out a plan with military precision. We needed a professional website, a lookbook, a registered business name. River Street Designs, she suggested, and it felt right immediately. It grounded the work in its origin, in its authenticity. She also insisted I start thinking about my time differently. "You are the artist," she said, her sharp eyes pinning me in place. "Your time is the most valuable asset in this company. Every hour you spend on accounting or sanding a plank is an hour you're not designing. Your job is the vision. You need to learn to delegate the execution." Delegate. It was a foreign concept. My entire journey had been a solitary struggle. The idea of entrusting any part of my work, my vision, to someone else was terrifying. But Juliana was right. The commissions for one-off pieces were already piling up, and I was just one person. The math didn't work. The tipping point came a week later. I received a call from a man named Marcus Thorne, the lead architect for one of the city's most celebrated design firms. He was designing a new restaurant, The Forge, in a historic downtown building and had attended the gallery opening. He was effusive in his praise, but his proposition was staggering. "I don't just want one of your tables, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "I want your aesthetic to define the entire space. We need 22 dining tables of various sizes, a 16-foot bar top, a host stand, and the shelving for the back bar. The theme is modern industrial heritage. Your work isn't just a fit. It is the theme." I listened, my hand gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles were white. The scale of it was beyond anything I could comprehend. It was a career-making opportunity, the kind of project that could catapult River Street Designs from an art project into a major player in the design world. It was also completely, utterly impossible. "The deadline is tight," he continued, oblivious to my internal panic. "We need everything delivered and installed in 3 months. 3 months. It had taken me that long to build the 5 pieces for the gallery show. "Mr. Thorne," I began, my mouth dry, "I'm a very small operation." "It's just me." "I know," he said. "That's part of the appeal. The authenticity. But I've seen your work. You're resourceful. Consider it a challenge." He named a budget that made my head spin. It was more than my original inheritance from my father. "Let me know by Friday," he concluded, and hung up. I stood in the middle of my workshop, the silence roaring in my ears. I looked at my hands, calloused and capable, but they were only 2 hands. For the first time, I felt the terrifying weight of my own ambition. I had wanted this, hadn't I? I had wanted to build an empire. I just never imagined the foundations would have to be laid so quickly. That evening, I walked down to Sam's workshop. He was closing up, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. I didn't need to say a word. He saw the look on my face. "What's wrong, kid? You look like you've seen a ghost." I explained the offer from Marcus Thorne, the impossible scale, the insane deadline. "He wants me to build half a restaurant, Sam. I can't do it. I have to turn it down." Sam leaned against his workbench, crossing his massive arms. He was silent for a long time, just watching me. "My first big job," he said finally, his voice a low rumble, "was for a shipyard. They wanted me to fabricate 50 watertight hatches in a month. I was 25, working out of a garage. I thought it was impossible. I stayed up for 3 days straight, just staring at the blueprints, trying to figure a way out. I almost called them to cancel. What did you do?" I asked. "I hired my 2 cousins and my neighbor's kid," he said with a shrug. Taught them how to do one part of the job perfectly. We worked 18-hour days. Made the deadline with half a day to spare. It nearly killed me, but it made my business. He looked at me, his gaze steady. You think you're the only person in this neighborhood who knows how to work hard? Who's looking for a chance? This place is full of them. You just gotta ask. His words were a splash of cold water. I had been so wrapped up in my own struggle, I hadn't seen the resources all around me. I hadn't seen the community. Do you know anyone? I asked, my voice hesitant. Welders? People who are good with their hands? A slow smile spread across Sam's face, a rare sight. I might know a guy, he said. The next day, he introduced me to Leo, a young man in his early 20s with a shock of black hair and welding burns up and down his arms. He was quiet and intense, but his eyes lit up when he saw my workshop. Sam explained that Leo was a gifted welder who had lost his job when a local auto body shop downsized. I showed Leo my designs, and he listened intently, asking smart, specific questions about the types of welds and the finish on the steel. I offered him a job on the spot, a salary that was more than fair. The look of relief and pride on his face was something I would never forget. A week later, on Leo's recommendation, I hired a woman named Maria, a meticulous carpenter who could perform miracles with wood. Suddenly, my workshop was no longer a solitary sanctuary. It was filled with the sounds of other people working, the hiss of Leo's welding torch, the hum of Maria's saws. It was chaotic and loud and wonderful. I called Marcus Thorne and accepted the job. My role shifted overnight. I was no longer just the maker. I was the leader, the designer, the project manager. I spent my days creating jigs, streamlining the production process, and my nights refining the designs and managing the budget. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Just as I was finding my footing in this new reality, the past sent out a subtle, chilling feeler. It was a text message from a number I didn't have saved, but I knew instantly who it was from. My sister, Catherine. Hi, Alara. In your neighborhood for a gallery thing? Heard you're a local celebrity now? How utterly bohemian. We should get coffee. Talk soon. XOXO, Cat. I stared at the message, the casual, condescending tone a familiar twist of the knife. Utterly bohemian. Local celebrity. She was trivializing my success, framing it as a quirky little hobby that had gotten out of hand. And yet she was reaching out. After months of complete and total silence, after leaving me for dead, she was proposing coffee. The timing wasn't a coincidence. She had heard about the money, the attention. The vultures were stirring. I felt a surge of cold fury. I typed out a dozen angry responses, my thumbs flying across the screen, then deleted them all. Showing them my anger would be a victory for them. It would prove their narrative that I was sensitive, emotional, and unstable. Instead, I took a deep breath, my father's words echoing in my mind. Show them. Don't tell them, I replied with a single polite sentence. Thank you, Catherine, but I'm afraid I'm too busy with my work right now. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. It was a simple statement of fact, but it felt like a declaration of war. It was the first time in my life I had ever set a boundary with my family. It was the first time I had ever valued my time, my work, more than their potential approval. That night, I stayed late at the workshop, long after Leo and Maria had gone home. The space was filled with the raw materials for the forge project, stacks of reclaimed lumber, racks of raw steel, the skeletons of 22 tables in various stages of assembly. It was a mountain of work, a testament to the impossible task ahead. A few months ago, this sight would have filled me with paralyzing fear. Tonight, it filled me with a powerful, unshakable sense of purpose. I was a businesswoman. I was a boss. I was the architect of my own life. And I was just getting started. Parte 6. The 3 months of the Forge project were a crucible. Time became a fluid, meaningless concept, measured only by the shrieking of saws and the incandescent glow of the welding torch. We worked around the clock, a small, determined army against an impossible deadline. My small apartment upstairs became little more than a place to shower and collapse for a few hours of dreamless sleep before the symphony of creation began again. The workshop, once my solitary refuge, was now a buzzing hive of activity, smelling of hot metal, fresh-cut oak, and the relentless ambition that drove us all. Leading a team was a terrifying and exhilarating new skill. I learned that leadership wasn't about giving orders. It was about removing obstacles. It was about ensuring Leo had the right gas mixture for a perfect weld, that Maria's saw blades were sharp, and that the coffee pot was never, ever empty. I discovered a fierce, protective pride in my team, seeing Leo's quiet confidence grow as he mastered a complex welding technique, or watching Maria solve an intricate joinery problem with a brilliant, elegant solution, gave me a satisfaction that was deeper and more profound than any personal artistic achievement. We were building more than furniture. We were building a company, a culture, from the ground up. The inevitable crisis arrived a month before the deadline. We were working on the centerpiece of the restaurant, the massive 16-foot bar top, which was to be crafted from a single continuous slab of reclaimed black walnut. We had sourced the perfect piece from a salvage yard 2 states away. It was a rare, beautiful slab, 200 years old, and it cost a significant portion of our materials budget. The day it was set to arrive, I got a call. The trucking company's flatbed had been in an accident. The driver was okay, but the slab of walnut was now a collection of splintered, unusable fragments on the side of a highway. Panic, cold, and absolute seized me. There was no time to find a replacement. No other slab of that size and quality existed in any of our suppliers' inventories. Marcus Thorne's entire design was centered on this singular, dramatic feature. Failure to deliver it would be a catastrophic breach of contract. I called an emergency meeting. Leo and Maria stood before me, their faces grim. The exhaustion of the past 2 months was etched on their features, and this news was a body blow. I saw the flicker of defeat in their eyes. For a moment, I felt the old Alara resurface, the one who would have given up, apologized profusely, and accepted failure as her destiny. Then I looked around the workshop, at the stacks of finished tables, at the raw steel waiting to be shaped, and a different instinct took over. The one that had been forged here, in this dusty, noisy space. Okay, I said, my voice much calmer than I felt. We can't get one big slab. So we changed the design. We don't hide the problem. We make it the feature. An idea born of pure desperation began to take shape. I grabbed a piece of chalk and started sketching on the concrete floor. We'll make the top out of smaller, interlocking pieces. A mosaic of different reclaimed woods. Walnut, oak, maple, cherry. Like a river of wood. And we won't join them perfectly. We'll leave small gaps, channels, and we'll fill them. With steel. Leo's eyes widened. Like an inlay? A metal inlay? Exactly, I said, the idea gaining momentum. We'll route out channels and pour molten pewter or bronze into them, so it looks like veins of metal are running through the wood. Maria ran her hand through her hair. The time it would take to cut and fit all those pieces? It's a huge risk, Alara. It's less of a risk than telling Marcus Thorne we can't build his bar, I countered. I looked at them, my team. I know it's a crazy idea. I know it's more work. But I believe we can do it. I believe it will be better than the original design. It will be unique. It will be ours. A slow grin spread across Leo's face. Pouring molten metal. I like it. Maria nodded, a determined glint in her eyes. The energy in the room shifted from despair to a kind of frenetic, defiant excitement. The crisis hadn't broken us. It had ignited us. The next few weeks were a creative frenzy. We worked with a singular, unified focus, our hands and minds in perfect sync. The bar top came to life, a stunning tapestry of wood and metal, far more dynamic and meaningful than a single slab could ever have been. It told a story of scarcity and ingenuity, of broken things being made whole and beautiful again. It was the story of River Street Designs. One afternoon, during a rare lull while we waited for a lacquer to dry, I was scrolling through a local news site on my phone when a photo stopped me cold. It was from the Society pages, a picture from the annual Children's Hospital Gala, the premier philanthropic event of the season. There, smiling for the camera, were my mother and Catherine. They were dripping in jewels, their gowns costing more than my entire payroll, their faces perfect masks of serene benevolence. They stood beside my brother, Richard, who had his arm around a woman I didn't recognize. The caption read, Beatrice Vance and daughter Catherine with Vance Steel, CEO Richard Vance and his fiancée, Amelia Davenport of the Davenport Textiles dynasty, a fiancé. They were merging dynasties. It was so perfectly on brand for my family. I scanned the accompanying article, which praised my brother's bold leadership before casually mentioning that Vance Steel stock had recently been downgraded by analysts due to softening international demand and failure to innovate. Failure to innovate. The phrase stuck with me. While they were posing for pictures and managing a slow decline, I was here, in the dirt and the noise, building something new. For the first time, I felt not a shred of envy. Only a profound, cleansing pity. The universe must have a dark sense of humor, because the very next day, a gleaming black town car, so out of place in my gritty neighborhood it looked like a spaceship, pulled up in front of the workshop. The back door opened and my mother, Beatrice, stepped out. She was dressed in a crisp white pantsuit that was utterly impractical for the environment. She surveyed the building's graffiti-adorned exterior with an expression of profound disgust, as if she were inspecting a particularly nasty stain. She walked in, her heels clicking on the concrete floor, bringing the cloying scent of her expensive perfume into my world of sawdust and ozone. Leo and Maria immediately fell silent, sensing the intrusion. "Alara," my mother said, her voice a jarring note of condescension in the workspace. "So this is it. Your little project." "It's a business, Mother," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. I stood my ground, not moving to greet her. This was my turf. "What are you doing here?" Her eyes swept over the organized chaos, the racks of finished furniture, the massive, half-finished bar. They lingered on Leo and Maria, who had pointedly gone back to their work, a silent show of solidarity. "Catherine told me you were busy," she said. "I see now. You're playing foreman with the local help." How very novel. The insult was aimed as much at my team as at me. I felt a flash of hot anger. They are skilled artisans and they are my employees. "What do you want?" She gave a long theatrical sigh. "I was worried, Alara. We're all worried. Living in this dreadful area, doing all this manual labor, it's not befitting. Richard's engagement to Amelia Davenport has put our family back in the spotlight. Your activities could be an embarrassment." "My activities," I repeated, my voice dangerously calm, "are paying my bills and building a reputable company. Something you might want to ask Richard about." I read about the stock downgrade. The shot landed. A flicker of anger crossed her perfect features. "That is temporary market fluctuation." "You wouldn't understand," she snapped. "Look, Alara, I came here to make an offer. Clearly you have some sort of rudimentary talent, but you have no head for business. This," she waved a dismissive hand around the workshop, "is not sustainable. I am prepared to offer you a loan, a significant one. We will set you up in a proper studio in the design district. Hire a real business manager. Fold you back into the family under our guidance, of course. We can frame this as your artistic phase before you came to your senses." I stared at her. The audacity of it was monumental. After casting me out, after declaring me unfit, she was here to co-opt my success, to sanitize it, to control it. She hadn't come to help me. She had come to buy me. I started to laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a laugh of pure, incredulous disbelief. "Let me get this straight," I said, walking slowly toward her. "You want to fold me back in? You want to take what I have built with my own two hands in this dreadful neighborhood with the local help and turn it into another one of your sterile, soulless vanity projects?" I stopped directly in front of her. I was taller than her in my work boots. I was stronger. I was covered in the evidence of my hard work, and she had never looked so fragile, so irrelevant. "No," I said, my voice low and clear. "Thank you for the offer, but River Street Designs is not for sale. Not my vision. Not my team. And not my name." I gestured toward the door. "Now, if you don't mind, we have a deadline to meet. You should go. You'll get your suit dirty." For the first time in my life, I saw my mother at a complete loss for words. Her mouth opened and closed. Her mask of cool composure had shattered, revealing the bewildered, furious woman beneath. She had come expecting to find her weak, sensitive daughter playing in a sandbox, a daughter who would be grateful for the scraps from her table. She had found a stranger, a queen in a kingdom of her own making. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out. The town car sped away, leaving a puff of exhaust in the air. Leo let out a low whistle. "Who was that?" "The competition," I said, a genuine smile finally breaking through. "All right, everyone. Let's get back to work. Let's go build a bar." 2 weeks later, our team stood in the middle of the forge an hour before its grand opening. The space was breathtaking. The lights gleamed off our tables, the shelves we'd built were filled with sparkling glasses, and the bar, our bar, was the undeniable soul of the room. It was magnificent, a river of wood and metal flowing through the space, a testament to our collective grit and vision. Marcus Thorne was ecstatic. The investors were thrilled, and we were exhausted and triumphant. We had done it. We had met the impossible deadline and exceeded every expectation. Standing there, surrounded by the fruits of our labor, I felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with money or revenge. It was the quiet, solid satisfaction of having built something real, something of value, with people I respected. My mother had tried to bring her world of shadows and manipulation into my world of substance and creation. She had failed. Her power over me was broken, forever. The empire I was building wasn't just made of wood and steel. It was made of something far stronger. Party 7 The Forge was more than a success. It was a phenomenon. It became the city's hottest restaurant, and not just for the food. Design critics and magazines wrote glowing articles, not about the chef, but about the space. My name, Alara Vance, and the name River Street Designs were on the lips of every architect, hotelier, and developer in the region. The wave of publicity that followed was overwhelming. We were inundated with requests for proposals, from boutique hotels in wine country to tech company headquarters in the city's gleaming new financial district. The order book for the next 2 years was full. My small workshop, once a cavernous empty space, was now impossibly cramped. We were tripping over each other, and the sheer volume of raw materials and finished pieces created a logistical nightmare. The success I had bled for was now threatening to suffocate me. I stood with Juliana and Sam in the middle of the chaotic workshop one evening, the air thick with the dust of our frantic productivity. You can't grow in a flower pot. Alara, Juliana said, stating the obvious. You need an industrial greenhouse. There's an old shipyard warehouse, Sam rumbled, stroking his beard. End of the street, right on the water. Been empty for 10 years. It's 5 times this size. Solid foundation. Got its own gantry crane. The thought was terrifying. It meant a business loan. A real one with multiple zeros. It meant hiring a dozen more people. It meant moving beyond a small, tight-knit crew into a real company with departments and a payroll that would give me nightmares. It meant becoming the very thing I'd never imagined, a captain of industry, but the fear was secondary to the drive. With Juliana's sharp financial mind and Sam's practical construction knowledge, we put together a formidable business plan. I walked into the same bank where I had opened my father's safe deposit box, not as a disinherited girl with a duffel bag, but as the CEO of a proven, profitable company. I presented my plan, my balance sheets, my projections. The bank manager, who had likely overseen my family's accounts for years, looked at me with a newfound, almost fearful respect. The loan was approved. We bought the shipyard. The renovation was a massive undertaking, but this time I had a team, a budget, and a clear vision. While a construction crew handled the main structural work, I focused on designing the workflow. It was my biggest project yet, and the client was my own company. In the midst of this exhilarating expansion, I stumbled upon an article in a national business journal. The headline was brutal: "The Rusting of a Titan, How Arrogance and Inaction Are Crashing Vance Steel." The lengthy piece detailed my brother, Richard's disastrous tenure as CEO. It spoke of his refusal to invest in new technologies, his focus on acquiring frivolous corporate luxuries like a new jet and a skybox at the stadium, and a series of disastrous gambles on the commodities market. The company was bleeding money, a major factory was facing closure, and thousands of jobs were on the line. The article painted him as a classic failson, a man who had inherited a throne but had no idea how to rule a kingdom. The final line was a quote from an anonymous board member. "He's a prince who thinks he's a king, and he has single-handedly dismantled a 100-year legacy." The accompanying photo showed Richard leaving a boardroom, his face ashen, his usual smirk entirely absent. I felt a cold, detached sense of vindication. The empire they had guarded so jealously, the one they deemed me too fragile to be a part of, was crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. The call came 2 weeks later. It was Richard's personal assistant, her voice stiff and formal, requesting an in-person meeting. He didn't want to meet at his office or a neutral location. He wanted to come to me. He arrived at the new shipyard warehouse on a gray, drizzly afternoon. I had told him to come to the new site, not the old workshop. I wanted him to see the scale of my new world. He stepped out of his car, looking smaller and paler than I remembered. The bespoke suit hung on him, no longer a symbol of power, but a costume he was struggling to fill. His fiancée was not with him. I met him in the cavernous main space. The renovations were still underway, the air loud with the sound of machinery and echoing voices. Skeletons of new workbenches and machinery stood waiting to be installed. The sheer raw potential of the space was palpable. It was the smell of the future. "Ilara," he said, his voice strained. He looked around, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "This is quite the operation." "We're expanding," I said simply. "Coffee?" I gestured to a makeshift table where we had a cheap drip coffee machine set up for the construction crews. "No, thank you." He cleared his throat, the sound of a man about to do something he found utterly distasteful. "I'll get to the point. You've probably read the news. Vance Steel is in a difficult position." "I read about the softening international demand," I said, quoting the euphemism from an earlier, kinder article. He flinched. "It's more than that. We're facing a liquidity crisis. A hostile takeover bid from a foreign conglomerate. We need to raise capital, quickly, to fend them off and modernize the primary mill." I just looked at him, waiting. I knew what was coming, and I was going to make him say it. Every word. "The banks have turned us down," he admitted, the humiliation evident in his voice. "Our traditional credit lines are frozen. The family, we need a loan. A significant one. An investment." "And you're asking me?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "It's not a handout," he said quickly, defensively. "It's an investment in your own family's legacy. Your name is Vance, too. If the company goes under, the name is worthless. Your little brand here is built on that history, whether you admit it or not." It was a weak, pathetic attempt at levity, and we both knew it. I let the silence hang in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. I watched him squirm. This was the man who had stood in the library and smiled as my world was torn apart. The man who had said, "Father knew you couldn't handle it. This is for the best. It protects you from yourself." Finally, I spoke. "Tell me about the numbers, Richard," I said, my tone shifting into that of a CEO. "What are your current liabilities? What's your proposed plan for modernization? What's the projected ROI on the capital expenditure? And what collateral are you offering to secure the loan?" He stared at me, bewildered. He had come prepared for an emotional argument, for recriminations or a tearful family reunion. He had not come prepared for a boardroom interrogation. He stammered through a series of vague, unconvincing figures and corporate buzzwords. He talked about synergy and refocusing core assets, but he couldn't hide the truth. The company was a sinking ship. When he was finished, I took a slow sip of my coffee from its styrofoam cup. "You're right," I said. "This isn't a handout, it's a business proposition. And as a business proposition, it's a terrible one." His face went white. "What?" "I've read your financials, Richard. The ones that are public, anyway. Your company is bloated and inefficient. Your leadership has been, to quote the Journal, a failure to innovate. You're not asking for an investment to grow. You're asking for a bailout to plug the holes in a ship you've steered into an iceberg. Vance Steel, under your leadership, is a bad investment." I stood up and walked over to look out the massive bay doors at the gray river beyond. The same river my father had told me about. The one that wears down stone. "Do you remember the day my father's will was read?" I asked, my back still to him. "You and Mother had it written that I was being unburdened by an inheritance I was not equipped to handle. You stood there and smiled as I was told I didn't have the mind for business, that I was too sensitive for the real world." I turned back to face him. The sounds of my new empire being built echoed around us. "Well, you were half right. I'm not equipped for your world, the world of inherited power and lazy, arrogant assumptions. But I've gotten very, very good at mine. And in my world, we don't throw good money after bad. We don't invest in failing leadership. And we don't bail out family just for the sake of a name." I walked back and stood before him, the final judge of his fate. "So, no, Richard. River Street Designs will not be investing in Vance Steel. The answer is no." He looked utterly broken. The last of his pride, his arrogance, his entire sense of self seemed to crumble in that moment. He had come to his weak, sensitive little sister for salvation, and had instead been clinically, calmly, and professionally destroyed by a businesswoman who was colder and smarter than he had ever imagined. "You'd just let the company die?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Your father's company?" "My father's company died a long time ago," I said. "You're just presiding over the funeral." I gestured to the door. "I have a business to run. You should see yourself out." He didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked away, a ghost in a tailored suit, swallowed by the vastness of the future I was building. I watched him go, and I felt nothing. Not hatred, not pity, not even satisfaction. It was just business. The debt was paid, the ledger was balanced, and I was free. Parte 2 years passed. The shipyard warehouse was no longer a dream, but a roaring, vibrant reality. River Street Designs had become a name synonymous with integrity and innovation. Our pieces furnished the lobbies of the most forward-thinking companies, the dining rooms of the most discerning clients. We were featured in international design publications, not just for our aesthetic, but for our business model. We sourced our materials sustainably. We paid our employees a living wage with full benefits, and we had an apprenticeship program for at-risk youth in the neighborhood, run by a now semi-retired but ever-present Sam. I was no longer just a businesswoman. I was a community builder. My life was full, not with the hollow pursuit of wealth, but with the profound satisfaction of meaningful work. I had found my way. The end of the Vance empire came not with a bang, but with a quiet, ignominious whimper. I read about it in the financial section of the morning paper. The hostile takeover had been successful. Vance Steel was sold for parts to the foreign conglomerate. The name, once a symbol of industrial might, was retired. The final assets, the grand mansion I grew up in, the art collection, my mother's priceless jewels, were auctioned off to pay a mountain of debt. Richard's high-profile engagement had been quietly called off months prior. They had not just fallen from grace, they had been erased from the ledger of the city's elite. I expected to feel a surge of triumph, a final sweet taste of revenge. But as I sipped my coffee in the sun-filled apartment I had built above the workshop, looking out at the river flowing steadily past my window, I felt nothing but a quiet, distant finality. Their story was over. Mine was still being written. They came on a Tuesday. I was in my office, a glass-walled space that overlooked the entire workshop floor, reviewing blueprints for a new public library commission. My assistant buzzed me, her voice hesitant. "Ms. Vance, your family is here. They don't have an appointment." I looked down at the workshop entrance. There they stood, a trinity of ghosts from a past life. Beatrice, Richard, and Catherine. They were a pathetic parody of their former selves. My mother's impeccable posture was gone, replaced by a weary slump. Richard's face was puffy and sallow, the ghost of his arrogance replaced by a haunted, hollowed-out look. Catherine, who had always been a perfect porcelain doll, looked cracked and faded, her designer clothes a size too big for her now rail-thin frame. They looked like refugees, washed up on the shores of my world. "Send them in," I said. They filed into my office, their eyes darting around at the clean lines of the furniture I had designed, the vast, bustling workshop below, the panoramic view of the river. It was a world of productive, creative energy, and they were utterly alien to it. "Alara," my mother began, her voice thin and reedy, a sound I had never heard from her before. The condescension had been replaced by a raw, naked desperation. We didn't know where else to go." "We've lost everything," Catherine whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. "The house, the accounts, everything." Richard, the former CEO, the prince who would be king, couldn't even meet my eyes. He just stood there, a monument to his own failure. "We are sorry, Alara," Beatrice said, the words sounding foreign and painful on her tongue. It wasn't an apology for the cruelty, for the years of dismissal, for the public humiliation. It was the frantic apology of the drowning, begging for a lifeline. "We were wrong. About you. About everything. We were terrible to you. But you're our family. You're our blood. You can't just turn your back on us." They were finally begging, crawling back, just as the title of my life story had been written that day, I walked away from their mansion. The scene I had once fantasized about, this moment of their complete and utter subjugation, was finally here. And it was just sad. There was no pleasure in it. Their ruin was not my victory. My victory was the life I had built in spite of them. I let them finish, listening in silence as they laid out the bleak reality of their situation. They were living in a small rented apartment, their funds nearly exhausted. They were facing a future they were completely, utterly unequipped to handle. When they were done, a heavy silence filled the office. They watched me, their faces a mixture of hope and terror. They were expecting a verdict, revenge or redemption. I leaned back in my chair, the chair I had designed and built, and looked from one broken face to the next. "When you cast me out," I said, my voice calm and measured, "you gave me nothing. No money, no home, no safety net. You told me I was unburdened, and you left me to sink or swim. And I swam." I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the controlled, beautiful chaos of my factory floor. "I can't give you back the life you lost. Money cannot fix what is broken in you. A life of leisure is a prison I wouldn't wish on anyone, and it is one you have proven you are not equipped to handle." I turned back to face them, their last hope dwindling in their eyes. The vengeful part of me, the wounded girl inside, wanted to tell them to leave, to give them the nothing they had given me. But as I looked at them, I didn't see monsters. I saw 3 weak, frightened people who had built their identities on a foundation of sand. To be as cruel as they were would be to admit that I was still one of them. And I was not. "Here is what I will do," I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. "I will pay the rent on a modest furnished 2-bedroom apartment for you for 1 year. Not a day more. I will give you each a stipend for that year, enough for groceries and essentials, but nothing for luxuries. And I will pay for each of you to meet with a career counselor who will help you write a resume and find a job. After 1 year, the support ends. What you do with that opportunity is up to you." They stared at me stunned. It was not the salvation they had begged for, but it was not the damnation they deserved. It was something else entirely, a chance. The same thing I had been given, a job. Catherine stammered, as if the word were a foreign language. "Yes, a job," I said. "It's how the world works. You can learn. Just like I did." I walked to my desk and wrote a name and number on a piece of paper. It was a property manager I knew. "This is the first step. The rest is up to you. This is the only help I will ever give you. We will not have family dinners. You will not be a part of my life. This is a business transaction, a final settlement of an old debt." I handed the paper to my mother. Her hand trembled as she took it. There were no tears of gratitude, only the dawning, horrifying realization that their lives would now be measured by work and budgets. "Thank you, Alara," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded once. "My assistant will show you out." After they were gone, a profound quiet settled over the office. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the river flow out to the sea. The final chains to my past had been broken. It was not forgiveness, and it was not revenge. It was closure. It was the cold, clean, and satisfying balancing of a ledger. I picked up the old Mont Blanc pen from my desk, the one my father had left me, its ink now having written contracts, signed paychecks, and sketched the blueprints of an empire he could have only dreamed of. The story he had hoped I would write was complete, but it was only the first volume. I turned away from the window, away from the past, and looked toward the large design board on the opposite wall. It was covered with sketches for the new library, a place of knowledge, community, and new beginnings. My work was waiting. My future was waiting. And for the first time, I felt truly, completely, and utterly unburdened.